In the spring of 1944, a German intelligence officer named Friedrich Falkenberg sat in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Caen and opened a folder that had taken his team 3 weeks to assemble. Inside were photographs, intercepts, vehicle sightings, radio direction finding reports, and a cross-referenced map of Allied command movements going back to January. His job was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. He needed to tell his superiors where the American generals were. Not approximately, precisely. Where they slept, where they worked, how they traveled, what their patterns were. The folder was comprehensive. Falkenberg had good men working for him, and the conclusion he reached after 3 weeks of meticulous intelligence work was something he would spend the rest of his career struggling to explain to officers trained in a system that assumed the opposite was true. He could not find them. Not because the Americans were using elaborate deception, though they were, not because the intelligence network was compromised, though parts of it were, but because the American generals had done something the German command structure regarded as almost professionally offensive. They had made themselves ordinary. If this kind of history matters to you, a like costs you nothing and helps this story reach the people who deserve to hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe. These men earned more than we can give them. The least we can do is remember. To understand what Falkenberg was looking for and why he could not find it, you need to understand what he expected to find. In the Wehrmacht, a general was visible by design. This was not vanity, though there was sometimes vanity in it. It was doctrine. The German command philosophy held that the commanding officer's physical presence was a weapon. His visibility communicated authority, imposed will on chaos, and served as a focal point that kept formations coherent under fire. A German general at the front, identifiable, deliberate, moving through his men with the calm of a man who had decided what the ground required, was doing his job as surely as the men firing rifles. The symbols of rank were therefore not merely ceremonial, they were operational. A German general wore his rank insignia. He traveled in a command vehicle that was configured for command, with radio equipment, with map boards, with the physical apparatus of decision-making mounted and visible. His staff traveled with him in a formation that any trained observer could identify at a distance. His headquarters had a pattern, a footprint, a set of signatures that showed up in aerial photography and agent reports with the regularity of a schedule. The Germans were very good at reading those signatures. They had been doing it since Poland. They knew what a corps headquarters looked like from the air, how many vehicles clustered in what pattern, where the communications antennas went, how close the general's vehicle stayed to the operations tent. They had developed through years of war on multiple fronts an intuitive catalog of what command looked like at every level of the Allied order of battle. The British were consistent, the French had been consistent, the Russians, for all their operational unpredictability, were consistent. The Americans were not consistent, or rather, they were consistent in a way the Germans had never encountered. They were consistently invisible. The story of why begins not in France, but in North Africa, in the winter of 1943. In a series of conversations that took place between a newly appointed army commander and the officers he was inheriting. Lieutenant General George S. Patton had just taken command of the Second Corps in Tunisia following the disaster at Kasserine Pass. He arrived to find an army that was demoralized, disorganized, and in the process of being comprehensively outfought by Erwin Rommel's veterans. Patton addressed many things in the weeks that followed. He tightened discipline, restored uniform standards, demanded physical fitness with the ferocity of a man who had no patience for comfort. But the thing he did that mattered most for the intelligence story is rarely discussed in accounts of his North Africa command. He started driving jeeps. Not exclusively, he still had his command vehicle, the armored car that appeared in photographs and newsreels, but Patton had noticed something on the roads of Tunisia that alarmed him in a way that the battle maps did not. German aircraft and German long-range gunners were finding Allied command elements with a regularity that suggested something more than luck. When he traced the pattern, the answer was obvious. The command vehicles were obvious. A 2.5-ton truck with 4 antennas and a cluster of staff cars around it, moving on a road in Tunisia, was not a mystery, it was a target. It said, "Here is where the decisions are made. Here is where to aim." Patton was not a theorist, he was a reader of battlefields, and what he read in Tunisia was that the American habit of concentrating command signatures in obvious places was costing lives. He began with the informal authority of a man who did not ask permission for things that seemed obviously correct to disperse. He moved in jeeps. He varied his routes. He wore a tanker's jacket over his rank insignia when he was forward. He did not create a predictable daily pattern. He told his staff to do the same. This was, in the language of intelligence work, defeating pattern analysis, and it worked not because it was elaborate, but because it was simple. A general in a jeep wearing a worn jacket sitting in the passenger seat of a vehicle indistinguishable from 10,000 other vehicles on the same roads was not a target, he was a man in a jeep. The lesson did not stay in Tunisia, it traveled. Omar Bradley absorbed it first and carried it furthest. Bradley is one of the least visually dramatic figures in the American command structure of the Second World War, which is itself a kind of military achievement. He was not tall, he did not wear a riding crop, he did not have a signature helmet or a carefully cultivated mythology. He wore the same olive drab as the men around him, carried the same equipment, traveled in vehicles that could not be distinguished from the motor pool at a glance. He did this deliberately and consistently from Tunisia, through Sicily, through the invasion of France, and into Germany. And he was precise about the reasons when asked. He did not talk about personal safety, at least not primarily. He talked about it as a command philosophy, an extension of the same logic that governed how he thought about headquarters placement and radio security and the distribution of command authority. A general who was invisible to the enemy was a general who could not be fixed, targeted, or eliminated. A general who could not be fixed could not be disrupted. And a commander who could not be disrupted retained the initiative even when the battle was going badly everywhere else. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters, which by the autumn of 1944 controlled more American soldiers than any headquarters in the history of the United States Army, was a persistent headache for German intelligence, not because it was hidden in a clever way, because it looked from the outside like a moderately busy administrative facility with unremarkable vehicle traffic and no obvious command signatures. There were no clusters of flag-bearing vehicles, no obvious general's car. The pattern of movement in and out of the facility did not suggest the presence of a man who was directing the operations of 1 million soldiers. German intelligence knew in the abstract that 12th Army Group existed. They could identify it on the order of battle. They could trace its general area of operations from radio intercepts. What they could not do was predict its internal rhythms, identify its commanding general's location at any given moment, or time an operation to disrupt it at a critical instant. The thing they were looking for had learned not to look like itself. There was a second layer to this problem, deeper than personal camouflage, that German intelligence struggled to articulate and never fully solved. The American command structure moved the decision-making. This is a harder concept than it sounds. In the German system, the commanding general and the command function were the same thing. Where Rommel was, there the decision was made. Where Model was, there the order originated. The general and the authority were inseparable, which meant that finding the general meant finding the authority, and disrupting one disrupted the other. The Americans had, partly by design and partly by the practical necessities of managing armies spread across hundreds of miles of front, separated the general from the command function in a way the Germans had not thought possible. Bradley, in the field, was making decisions. His staff at the main headquarters was also making decisions, delegated decisions, within boundaries Bradley had established before he left. His subordinate corps commanders were making decisions within their boundaries. His army commanders were making decisions within theirs. The authority was distributed. It was in many places at once. It moved when Bradley moved, but it did not leave when Bradley left, because the layers beneath him were not waiting for his return to act. A German intelligence analyst trying to disrupt American command decision-making faced a problem that his training had not prepared him for. He could disrupt a node. He could not disrupt the network, because the Americans had, without calling it by that name, built a command network rather than a command hierarchy. Removing any single node, even the topmost one, degraded the network. It did not destroy it. This was the thing Falkenberg had been circling without being able to name when he read his folder outside Caen. He was looking for the head of the snake, and the snake, as it turned out, did not have a single head. It had many, distributed along its entire length, any of which could assume the functions of the one before it without stopping to ask permission.
Patton, whom the Germans spent extraordinary effort tracking, is the most complete illustration of how this worked in practice, partly because he was the most aggressively hunted, and partly because his personality made him both the most obvious and the most elusive target in the entire American command structure. He was obvious because he cultivated a visible mythology. The twin ivory-handled revolvers, the speeches, the deliberate performance of command presence, the news photographs, the radio intercepts in which subordinates referred to him in terms that left no doubt about his role. All of this created a target. German intelligence knew Patton. They could identify his voice, recognize his methods, trace his operational signature in the pattern of advances his armies made. What they could not do was find him when they needed to. This was partly the jeep habit he had developed in Tunisia and refined through Sicily, but it was also something more systematic. Patton, for all his theatrical presence, had absorbed the lesson that command visibility and personal visibility were different things. He could be visible to his men, could put himself forward at the decisive moment, could use his presence as a force multiplier in the way German doctrine prescribed, and simultaneously be invisible to German intelligence, because the presence he displayed to his men was not the presence that showed up in the signatures German analysts were trained to find. He was visible to the people he wanted to influence. He was invisible to the people who wanted to kill him. This sounds simple. It required a sustained discipline that most commanders at his level found nearly impossible to maintain, because the habits of high command, the tendency to centralize, to be present, to be findable by subordinates, created the same signatures that made commanders findable by enemies. Patton broke the habit. He forced his staff to break it. And he did it consistently enough across 3 campaigns on 2 continents that the German intelligence files on his location were, with rare exceptions, days or weeks out of date by the time they reached the officers who needed them.
The consequences of this invisibility were not abstract. In December of 1944, during the opening days of the German counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht's operational plan included, as a secondary objective, the disruption of American command and communications in the rear areas. German commandos, the Skorzeny brigades in American uniforms, had been given a list of targets: American command vehicles, communications centers, and, at the top of the list, specific American generals whose elimination would, in German doctrinal terms, decapitate the formations in their area. The commandos caused chaos. They moved signs, cut telephone lines, created confusion about routes and dispositions that rippled through rear area units for days. The psychological effect, the knowledge that German soldiers in American uniforms were moving through Allied lines, was disproportionate to their actual numbers. But they did not find the generals. They did not find them because the generals were not where the signatures suggested. They were not in the vehicles that a trained German observer would identify as command vehicles. They were not in the headquarters buildings that appeared on captured maps. They were moving in patterns that defied the analytical framework the commandos had been given, because that framework had been built on 5 years of fighting armies that made themselves findable. The Americans specifically, deliberately, and by that point habitually, refused to make themselves findable. The day after the Ardennes offensive began, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting at Verdun to coordinate the Allied response. The meeting brought together Bradley, Patton, British and French commanders, and the men who would shape the next 3 weeks of fighting. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential single conferences of the Western campaign. German intelligence did not know it was happening. They did not know because the men who drove to Verdun that morning did so in vehicles that did not announce their importance. They did not know because the communication security that Eisenhower's headquarters had maintained since England held, even in the first desperate hours of the offensive. They did not know because the patterns that Falkenberg and his colleagues had spent months trying to read had been specifically engineered not to be read. At the meeting, Patton, who had already begun mentally repositioning his Third Army before he left his headquarters, told Eisenhower he could attack north into the flank within 48 hours. The statement seemed impossible. It was not, because Patton, invisible to German intelligence, had been thinking 3 days ahead in a situation where the Germans believed he was still processing what had happened. The counterattack came, the relief of Bastogne came, and the German offensive, which had been planned, in part, around the assumption that disrupting American command would buy time for the initial penetration to become irreversible, failed in part because the command it was designed to disrupt could not be found.
There is a man who belongs in this story who is not a general, and whose name almost no one knows. His name was Sergeant First Class Harold Wickham. He was Patton's driver through Sicily through the end of the war in Europe, a man from a small town in Kansas who had been assigned to Patton's motor pool in 1943 and had proven himself by doing 3 things extremely well. He drove fast, he drove quietly, and he did not talk about where he had been. Wickham drove a Jeep that had been stripped of any marking that would identify it as a general's vehicle. No flags, no special equipment visible from outside. He knew every road, every secondary route, every farm track in the areas where Patton operated. Not because he had studied maps, but because he drove them, continuously, until he had internalized the ground the way a man internalizes the layout of a house he has lived in for years. He told his daughter, in a conversation she preserved in a memoir written decades after the war, that he thought of his job as making the general disappear, not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. His job was to put Patton where Patton needed to be, and to do it in a vehicle that arrived without announcement and left without a trace. He said that in 3 years of driving Patton through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, they were never stopped by enemy troops, never caught in an ambush that was clearly meant for them, never the targets of fire that suggested the enemy knew who was in the vehicle. He attributed this to 2 things: Patton's intuition about when to move and when to stay, and his own refusal to ever take the same road twice if a different road was available. He said it was not a system, it was a habit, and the habit was simple enough to explain in 1 sentence: never be where they expect you to be. Major Falkenberg survived the war. He was captured by the Americans in April of 1945 near the town of Hanover, when his vehicle he was traveling in was stopped at a checkpoint by 2 American military policemen who were, by his account, so young they did not look old enough to shave. He spent 8 months as a prisoner before being released and returning to his family in Bavaria. He found work eventually as a surveyor, a profession that suited a man trained to read ground. In 1958, he gave an interview to a German military history journal that was publishing a retrospective on the intelligence war on the Western Front. The interviewer asked him what he considered the single greatest intelligence failure of the campaign. Falkenberg was quiet for a long moment.
He said it was not a failure of technique. He said his men had been good. The network had been as competent as the circumstances allowed. The analysis had been thorough. The failure, he said, was a failure of assumption. He said the German intelligence apparatus had spent years building a model of what a commander looked like, how he moved, where he could be found, how his patterns could be read. And that model had been accurate for every army the Wehrmacht had faced until the Americans arrived. The Americans, he said, had read the same model and had then done something that struck him in retrospect as almost obvious once you understood the logic of it. They had built an army specifically designed not to fit inside it. He said the American generals understood that the model existed. They had studied it, either consciously or through the experience of fighting people who used it, and they had then made themselves illegible to it, not by hiding in bunkers, not by refusing to lead, by leading in a way that looked from the outside like something other than leading. He said that was the part he could never quite explain to his own commanders, who continued to believe until the end that if you looked hard enough and long enough at the right things, the American generals would eventually become visible. They never did, not because they were not there, but because the idea of what a general looked like, an idea Falkenberg and every German intelligence officer had inherited from Prussia and refined through 5 years of war, was not the idea the Americans had built their generals around. The German general was visible by design. Authority announced itself. Command was a presence you could find, photograph, target, and eliminate. The American general was effective by disappearance. He was in the jeep in the line of jeeps. He was in the farmhouse with no flags out front. He was on the road at 0400 when the predictive models said he was sleeping. He was 3 days ahead of the situation in a location no one had thought to look, making decisions that would not show up in German intelligence reports until the effects of those decisions were already irreversible. The model never fit. And the war in the West was decided, in some part, in the gap between what German intelligence expected to find and what American command had decided to be. Harold Wickham, Patton's driver, came home to Kansas in September of 1945. He went back to working on his family's farm. He married a woman named Dorothy the following year. He never wrote a memoir and never sought attention for his service. His daughter, in the memoir she wrote many years after his death, remembered one thing he said about the war that he repeated more than once and that she did not fully understand until she was much older. He said that the most important thing he ever learned in the Army was not how to drive fast, or how to read a map, or even how to keep his mouth shut, though all of those things mattered. The most important thing, he said, was that the enemy is always watching. And if the enemy is always watching, then the question you ask yourself every morning is not, what do I need to do today? The question is, what does the enemy expect me to do today? And then you do something else. That sentence, spoken in a farmhouse in Kansas to a daughter who was not old enough to fully understand it, is a more complete description of American command philosophy on the Western Front than most of the histories written about it. The German system was built on the idea that command has a face and a location and a pattern, and that the right intelligence operation can find all three. The American system was built on the opposite idea, that the most dangerous commander is the one you are not looking for, the one in the jeep that looks like every other jeep, the one in the farmhouse with no flags, the one who already moved 3 hours ago to a place you have not thought to look. Major Falkenberg spent 3 weeks and the labor of his best men trying to find the American generals in France in the spring of 1944. He found a folder full of photographs, intercepts, and vehicle sightings. He did not find the generals. They were already somewhere else. Thank you for being here for this. If this story reached you, a like is the simplest thing you can do to help it reach someone else. Subscribe if you have not, and hit the bell if you want these stories delivered when they are ready. I want to hear where you are watching from today, and if you had someone in your family who served in the Second World War, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up hearing around a table, tell me about them below. They carried these stories for the rest of their lives. Most of them never told them out loud. That is what this